Hi, Dirk.
Hi, Richard. Can I call you Richard?
Feel free. Dick is what I'm usually called.
Dick. Well, nice to meet you, Dick. Uh,
Okay.
do you want to put on the video or are you more
Let
comfortable?
me, no, no, let me turn it on.
Uh, there you are.
At any rate, so what can I do for you?
I'm very curious about a couple of topics. First of all, you're in Paris right now, right?
Yes, yes.
And what brings you to this lovely city?
Well, my wife is French, and Paris is a lovely city, as you say.
You're right. Reason enough in itself. So before we dive into this beautiful amalgam of climate and science and subsidy and hysteria and dispute, first of all, let me start off on the comic notion that I read in your on the Wikipedia profile. There's my little research, of course, had to go. But that's where it all starts. That you are essentially a child of immigrants, a Jewish kid from a Catholic neighborhood in the Bronx, who managed to climb up to be a professor of MIT. So my question to you is, you must love that movie Good Will Hunting.
Um, I didn't even know the movie.
No, you gotta be kidding me.
Oh,
It's about this mathematical wonder kid from South Boston who accidentally gets noticed as being a cleaner at MIT,
oh yes.
and he solves this riddle on the hallways, and then he becomes this highly profile.
I think that's highly romanticized.
Okay, well, I'm going to shoot at you with a couple of notes that I've made.
Sure.
Of course, this topic is going to relate to the climate issue, global warming, and whether or not it is a apocalyptic threat to us, whether or not CO2 plays a role in it, whether or not humans play a role in it at all, etc., etc. Um, so I'm going to shoot at you in reverse. First of all, am I right to conclude that during the dinosaur age, there were no ice caps and the dinosaurs were doing just fine before the asteroid hit them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, how should I put it? I have a question for you.
Right.
Have you ever bothered to look at the Working Group 1 report of the UN's IPCC?
No, I have not.
That's an interesting thing. In other words, you've been told lots of stuff, and you haven't even bothered to look if it's part of the official document.
Right.
And I think you're not alone in that. You
Right.
have CEOs of oil companies who haven't done that. They simply go with what they have been told by the media, by the political system, and so on. There's a man, Steve Koonin, a friend, put together a book where he doesn't question the official documents. They just don't say what you've been told.
Exactly. Well, I have heard, but I haven't checked it firsthand, so I haven't not read these documents myself. But I have noticed from third hand that other people saying that in these original documents, yes, there is mention of climate and perhaps of climate change, but not of the alarmist scenario. How do
Exactly.
you say this?
I mean, as has often been pointed out by many people, the danger they're proposing is by the year 2100, GDP, instead of being 200% more than today, will only be 197%. Who is going to run for shelter from that? Greta Thunberg?
Because you will have a slightly smaller villa-side pool, swimming pool. Yeah, in tropical Norway.
Right. Well, isn't it Sweden?
Oh, Sweden. Tomato, tomato, if you ask me.
No, I mean, I spent a year in Norway. During that time, we were told what was wrong with Sweden.
Right. These old rivalries.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I believe the Scandinavians, so particularly the Danish, Swedes, Norwegians, and Icelandic peoples, are so close to one another through all being transponents of essentially Vikings, is that they can talk with each other. So their
Oh, yeah.
differences are so small that they can practically have a chat.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah,
It is sort of a Scandinavian language.
exactly. So as we already concluded that the dinosaurs were doing just fine in their tropical paradise, let's reverse engineer this psychological problem. So are we agreeing on the fact that yes, there is such a thing as climate on Earth, on specific parts of Earth? Yes, it changes. Perhaps there is some change due to the
Anthropomorphic activities.
exactly. Thank you. However, there is this magnifying lens through which a lot of peoples on Earth tend to observe these phenomena, in which they tend to skip forward to possibility of apocalypse. Might that be, this is my little personal theory, I was thinking about this historically, where the climate alarmism arose, that is particularly Northern Europe and the United States. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it didn't arise from science, that's for sure.
exactly. Well, that why then did it arise from China or Japan? Why didn't it arise from?
Oh, no.
Exactly.
I think it,
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I have this little theory that if we go back all the way, the Northern European and therewith predominantly the United States and Canadian cultures have arisen from mostly from a strand of Christianity that is Protestant. So that was the most dominant formatting religion at the time. And of course, Christianity is originally way back is a Jewish sect from first AD Judea. And together with the Essenes, these sects were very strong in their apocalyptic thinking. And of course, then throughout the Middle Ages, Northern Europe became Protestant, Calvinist in particularly. Now, what are the most Calvinist countries on earth? Mine, the Netherlands. And of course, Germany, where Lutheranism arose, Switzerland, where Calvinism factually arose, and of course, their biggest transport or export, the United States, as the pilgrims on the Mayflower were literally coming from a Calvinist school in Leiden as they departed. So there's this very strong Calvinist grid line. Where is Calvinism very specific in? A number of things. It's the most insane strand of religion I know, almost on par with, let's say, Wahhabist Islam or any other fundamental group. It's very, very insane. But that's just my little antipathy towards my own cultural grid line. However, it stands out as one of the most apocalyptic thinking strands of Christianity. And of course, Christianity and Islam, and to a lesser extent, certain strands of Judaism, are essentially apocalyptic thinking. And this particular brand of Christianity that has formatted most of the Northern Europe, UK, and America has this concept of there being of we all being sinful and all being doomed to go to hell, but there is this small chosen group within that are a tad more moral and might have a chance not to go to hell when they self-flagellate a lot. That is Calvinism. It has formatted the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, and to a lesser extent UK, and it has had a profound impact on the generic culture of the United States. So am I onto something there, that this apocalyptic thinking is cultural?
Partly, I think, you're pointing to a vulnerability. But I think the real issue is who is exploiting this vulnerability and why. And I think that's perhaps more important. Thinking in terms of catastrophe, apocalypses, and so on, may be baked into the cake, but it's pretty clear objectively that there were, how shall I put it, objects that were being addressed with this technique for other reasons. And so I think those are the things to focus on. You've pointed a vulnerability. The question is who's making use of it and why. And my own feeling is that there is an antagonism toward Western society. In America, there's some pretty good reasons why, and they're nasty. I mean, a lot of what I'm seeing in the States and communicated to Europe stems from the period immediately after World War II. And that's not totally divorced from your picture of Calvinism. What happened after World War II? In the US initially, and subsequently in Europe, there was a period of immense development and prosperity. Part of that prosperity in the States meant in the 20 years following World War II, ordinary working people were enabled to get houses, cars, to live well. And I was in college during this period, in the 50s, early 60s. And it was amazing how disparaged the working people were. I don't know, have you ever heard of the folk singer Pete Seeger?
By name, I'm not familiar with his work.
Anyway, he was a very famous folk singer in the US. He was a communist. And he had a song, Little Houses Made of Ticky-Tack. It's condemning the poor aesthetics of these working people. Oh, such ugly houses they had, and so on. So what's going on all the time, disparaging the success of working people. And then came the Vietnam War. Of course, this was not in Europe, but I'll get back to the European connection. What happened? Well, America still had a draft, compulsory service. And who went to war? Working middle class. And at that time, people in college were a kind of elite. We still hadn't had the massive increase in higher education. And they were taking draft deferments. And rather than feeling grateful that they could avoid the war, they decided it was virtuous to do this. That America was evil, that North Vietnam was virtuous. They didn't pay much attention to the fact that people were fleeing south, not north in Vietnam. And so there arose this notion that one had to reform America, and that you had groups that were quite violent, whether underground, Students for Democratic Society, and so on. People were being killed. Things were robbed, and so on. In fact, we were personally exposed to that a little bit. I was in Chicago at the time. I was a professor there. And we spent the summer in Colorado. And I had a student take care of our apartment while we were gone. Came back, the police were monitoring our apartment. And the student had used it as a crash pad for the Students for Democratic Society. We come in, the place is a mess, and there's all sorts of stuff around, including the mimeographed sheets explaining how to poison the Chicago water supply.
Wow. This is Chicago anti-Vietnam riots, right? Those famous ones.
Yeah. And this was the year of the Democratic Presidential Convention. So
your apartment became like anarchy HQ, so to speak.
Or something like that. One of them, anyway. But you had this, you saw this going on, and then Nixon was elected president, and one thought that's been taken care of more or less. But of course it wasn't. This was the march through the institutions beginning. And I'm going to speak to that some other group shortly. But what was happening was they essentially were taking over the educational system. By the 90s, certainly by the George Floyd riot, they were ready to do so, but they had already long since taken over the schools of education, the departments of social science, humanities, and now even science, technology, and so on, with this diversity, equity, and inclusion, setting one race against another, and so on. Crazy situation in the States at the moment. But what's forgotten in all this is that this was a revolutionary movement. It was based on a true detestation of Western society. It had its Marxist component. And as with all such revolutionary processes, they weren't just interested in the schools. They were interested in the productive sectors of society. And the vehicle for that was taking over the environmental movement. And so you'll notice, I don't know, I think it was pretty much the same in Europe. Initially, the Greens were concerned with things like whales, endangered species, clean air and water, this sort of thing, obvious. But beginning with Earth Day, 1970, the focus was almost entirely on the energy sector. And the energy sector had a couple of benefits. One, it was basic to all production. And two, it involved trillions of dollars. And that's crucial because governments can give out trillions and people get those trillions, which is a temptation. There are people who always want to get trillions if you're giving them out, and they only have to kick back 1 or 2% or 3% to pay off the politicians, so the politicians will support the rebuilding of the energy sector. And so you have this nasty combination. One of the things that scares me a little is I have often wondered, why is there such a close correlation between people's views on climate and their views on Palestine? Greta Thunberg is a great example of that.
But wouldn't that be just the groupthink, as they are so programmed to think in this oppressor-oppressee mode?
Oh, it fits, it all fits in that. Although the climate isn't exactly in that.
Well, they are shouting queers for Palestine, like Kentucky, like chickens for KFC.
I mean, I noticed something. I mean, for instance, with the climate issue, when do you think it began?
As a ideological movement, you mean?
As a movement, as we have to do, the climate is dangerous, we have to do something.
I would guess the 70s or 80s?
Early 80s, late 70s, or mid 70s even, it was beginning. And you had, for instance, during the early 80s, there were a couple of meetings, one in Bellagio at a kind of resort owned by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, and another in Austria at Villach, trying to drum up interest and support for using climate as a mode of alarm. Rockefeller Brothers, what else are they doing? Turns out they support various pro-Hamas groups.
Yes.
And so, my feeling is their aim is malicious destruction of Western society.
Yeah.
And, this is running through. You can tell it's political. It has nothing to do with science. Because for years they were pushing, you had Guterres at the UN. If you go from 1 degree to 1.5 degree, it's curtains. And you ask yourself, why do rational people think that a temperature difference that they live with every day from 1 hour to the next is curtains? It makes no sense. It's small. And ordinary people, I think, ask that, and at least in the US, you find most ordinary people don't buy this. Why do educated people often buy it? I think the reason is, having spent most of my life teaching, most people at university are not geniuses. They are not going to be contributors to knowledge. They're getting credentials for jobs. And what do they learn? They learn that they must do whatever is necessary to please their professor and get a good grade. What have they learned? They've learned to rationalize anything, no matter how stupid.
Right.
So they'll buy the propaganda.
I recently wrote this, I actually made a video about it, but it's unfortunately in Dutch. I wish I had made it in English so I could share it with you and others, because I thought it was one of my best rants so far. It was about the mayor of Amsterdam, Femke Halsema. And of course, now Amsterdam is being torn apart by the same pro-Hamas woke riots. As you might know, Amsterdam has one of the most harshest and most sensitive relationships with the Holocaust topic of any city in Europe.
Oh, how shall I put it?
It's a little sensitive, of
The
course.
record of Holland is
Yeah.
nearly as bad as Poland during the
It's the
Holocaust.
second highest mortality rate after
Right.
Lithuania. And
In France,
yeah, you could hide someone in France.
no, more Dutch Jews survived by fleeing to France than survived in Holland.
Yes, exactly. The funny thing about it, of course, is that we as Dutch are kind of like river Germans. We're like marine Germans.
Yeah.
So we share this same obsession with bureaucracy. So we were in a phase which is in Dutch is called the verzuiling, which stopped somewhere in the 50s or 60s with the sexual revolution. And it was this idea of een zuil is a column. It's like a Greek column or a,
Yeah.
and as you have like the 5 pillars of Islam, we had like Catholics, Protestants, Jews, atheists, communists. You had this little islands, and people lived on their islands and had their own church or their own assembly, and that was it. And people lived very separately, but kind of like peacefully. But they all were registered as such. So the Germans just came in, conquered the main offices in Amsterdam and The Hague, and just saw, oh, okay, this one, there's all the Catholics, communists, and Jews, and of course the latter two, which was what they were after. So that was very sad. But Amsterdam had
It's interesting, in France, ever since then, they take no census information about religion.
even ethnicity, because if they want to measure how many, like let's say migrants, for example, they have a very big ghetto problem, of course, in Paris, where you're at, Saint Denis and those banlieues, so these
Yeah.
ghettoized, high-rise suburb areas, which are absolutely massive. Because as a Dutch person, you traditionally always go on vacation to the south of France or Greece. That's what Dutch people do, sometimes Spain. So in the case of southern or central France or Spain, you have to pass the ringway of Paris. And Paris is so big, it has two ringways, one around the, let's say, the old city, which is the 1900 city, and then the really big ringway, which you have to pass to get south, past the city by south. and it takes almost 1.5 hours to pass Paris outer ringway, and all of it is ghetto. Like it's like those concrete Molochs staring you in the face. But they don't know exactly how the demographic percentages are because they refuse to measure it, which I think is a very smart and civilized and sensible thing not to do.
I think, France is, I'm not pessimistic about it. I think Belgium bothers me more in some ways.
Why?
Because, for better or for worse, there are no Islamic political parties in France.
Right.
There are in Belgium, which
And
means a certain degree of separation.
yeah.
I mean, France has assimilated a lot. I think one of the problems is if you have a society with the notion of laïcité, Islam has certain problems fitting into that. And I think France may be closer than other countries to recognizing this as an issue that has to be dealt with. We'll see how it evolves, but I mean, it's interesting. And for instance, at the moment, the pro-Hamas demonstrations are far greater in the US than in France, despite there being a much larger Muslim population here in France.
But perhaps because there is a smaller Muslim, of course, we in the west of Europe, have had our experience for over what is it now, 50 or 60 years with having a large, mostly North African or Turkic minority. So in Germany, it's mostly Turks. In the Netherlands, it's a combination of Moroccans and Turks, which are the largest subpopulations of
Sure.
Muslims.
And there's been the large inflow of Syrian refugees.
Yeah, lately, of course, they have. And of course, there are some cultural differences. Of course, Turks are technically a whole different people than Arabs or Berbers or Middle Eastern people altogether. But we have had a sizable Muslim minority, especially the last 40 years since it became a little bit more solid. So we have a certain experience with it. And of course, there is this thin line where realistic observations, and also, of course, I have to acknowledge I live in a certain neighborhood now. I don't want to be derogatory about my fellow lowly educated Dutch people, but there is, of course, this, if we compare it to Nazi Germany or to any fascist undertone, there is this dumb pro-racism, if I can choose some ugly words, that exists in white underclasses. But at the same time, there is this very realistic observation of the lack of susceptibility of Islam to adapt to kind of like secular enlightenment values. That is also true, and it's a minefield, of course. But I do think the political correctness concerning this issue, yeah, I would agree. It probably varies a lot country by country. But of course, in America, they don't have that experience themselves, so they might be more naive. Could that be as simple as that?
There's no question about that. I mean, one of the things in France is you have a lot of people who are not Muslims, often Jewish, who are Arabic speaking.
Right.
So, we live in a neighborhood that's heavily immigrant.
Yeah.
And we're about 5 minutes walk from a large Jewish school. We're 10 minutes walk from the main Islamist mosque.
Right.
When on Friday, during the summer especially, when there are sermons at the mosque, they have an overflow crowd. And so the sermon is blasted through loudspeakers into the courtyard. The Jews walking by, especially the women, listen. And the following day at Sabbath services, they discuss what they've heard. But, it's very different in the States. Nobody understands what's going on in the mosque because very few people in America know Arabic. In Paris, if the imam is going over the top in his sermon, there's every chance he'll be back in Algeria the next day.
Right.
So there's some familiarity. We've heard, I mean, from people in Israel and so on, that, there's this gentle conflict between Jews from Europe and Jews from North Africa and the Arab world.
Mm.
And today, the demographics are favoring the so-called Sephardim.
Yeah.
And one of them remarked that, the European Jews, they should get out of the way because we know Arabs and they don't.
Right.
And, so there's a familiarity with the culture.
It's very interesting that you say that because I can, of course, not all Dutch Jews died during the Second World War, and they have repopulated to a certain extent, and they're quite prolific artistically and culturally. So there's, of course, like famous television people or famous intellectuals that we know and that we see pass by, and there is this tendency. And I think that is a very ironic, of course, this entire Israel-Palestine thing among the woke white middle class youngsters in universities in countries such as the Netherlands or United States. It's an endless gross mirroring of paradoxes, of course. It's almost comical, but it's also tragically comical. But you can tell that these, let's say, these Dutch descendants or survivors, descendants of the Holocaust survivors, who were overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, originally
Yes.
German Jews or Polish Jews that once landed in the Netherlands, many whom landed in the 30s in flight of Germany, only to be occupied once again. But they're mostly European Jews, and they tend to cling very strongly to that socialist as well as anti-racist sentiment that they, of course, built, that of course has a very tight relation to that Holocaust and pre-Holocaust trauma. But they end up in this cul-de-sac, this paradox, whereas they want to not be racist against the Muslim immigrants because they know what it's like to be an immigrant or to be from a certain Semitic culture or to be oppressed or discriminated against or whatever. But at the same time, they have to blind themselves to the fact that there's only one real anti-Semitic party or demographic, which is not a million of Nazis in the Netherlands or a million of whatever. It's those Muslims they try to defend from discrimination that have the most hegemonic anti-Jewish sentiment.
Yeah.
Which is a big paradox.
It's a paradox. I think people are learning slowly, but you're right. I mean, I think in America, most Jews are on the left.
Mm.
And but the left has changed so dramatically.
Yeah.
I mean, at one time it was working people. Now you have this bizarre situation in America where the left is the party, the Democrats are the party of the ultra wealthy and the welfare clients.
Right.
And the right is the party of the working people.
Yeah. Either rich or poor working people, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it takes time for these adjustments and changes to occur. It's not the first time, but it does lead to the paradoxes you mentioned.
Yes.
And I think the present situation is, how shall I put it, educational in that respect. Paris is interesting. France is interesting. There is in Paris very large and very lovely Institute of the Arab World.
Mm.
I believe the director of it is now Jewish. It deals with the cultural issues of the Arab world, particularly North Africa. There is a state-sanctioned mosque. It competes to some extent with the Islamist mosque.
Yeah.
So, alternatives grow. There's a generational issue with Muslims here. During the war, World War II, Algerian troops fought very well for France, the Harkis. But the younger people are often, unemployed. They're afflicted by this. They feel that the society is not treating them well, and so on and so forth. We'll see how it evolves. As I say, I'm not totally pessimistic. I think there's much more awareness here than in the States. States have a very peculiar situation. I mean, universities were vulnerable. And so, for instance, at Harvard, I think something like 20% of the students now are from the Arab Middle East.
Hmm.
They're paying full tuition, which with room and board in America is over $100,000 a year.
So they're petroleum children.
Yeah, yeah. And not just that. I mean, there was a list of the student organizations at Harvard who were defending Hamas.
Hmm.
And out of the 31, 30 of them were actually Muslim student organizations, students from Pakistan, Bangladesh, not just the oil states.
Yeah, recently I wanted to get a grip on this entire theological aspect of this. I'm interested in the Catholic Protestant thing because it has affected my culture a lot. But I'm also interested in these roots of anti-Semitism, but also these conflicts between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So I just thought, well, F it. I'm just going to read the entire King James Bible, so the entire Old and New Testaments and the Quran, which I've started. I'm in.
Can I recommend a book which is I found somewhat
Right. Yeah, sure.
Tom Holland has a
I know
book.
the English historian, right?
Yeah. What is it? The Shadow of the Sword, on the growth of the Arab Empire.
Right.
And he discusses the issues with the Quran and so on, and the Hadiths.
Right.
The only thing peculiar about the book was it's about 450 pages, and he doesn't get to the Arabs until page 300. What's going on before that? Well, there is this conflict going on before the Arabs come in 650 something between the Romans out of Constantinople
Yeah.
and the Persians.
Right. Sassanids.
And it's out of that conflict and the destruction that the Arabs became mercenaries and then eventually went on the march.
All right. So it's another one of those examples. They were like the Mujahideen who became the Taliban. They were trained by the
Yeah.
Washington, Constantinople, and accidentally they were weaponized to come invade at another time.
Yeah. I mean, but also part of the invasion was the kind of horrifying techniques one saw on October 7th.
Right.
And at least in the initial part, that was a very effective means to defeat countries. It just horrified them.
Yes.
And today, there's a late author, Walter Lacour. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. But he has numerous books on the history of terrorism.
Mm.
And within that history, modern history, he argued the first terrorists were Armenians. And the whole point of terror was you were not strong. It was a tool of the weak. And that's a very different situation from the initial use by the Muslims of terror, which was a sign of strength.
Well, there's of course a difference in terrorism and the deployment of terror. Whereas if you're a
Yes.
guerrilla style insurgent trying to overcome your minority of numbers through insidious little attacks on the system, it's a different thing when you're a huge majority scaring the shit out of a population that you just conquered, of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's exactly correct.
I started reading the Quran recently, or not reading. Actually, there's this website, I think it's playing Quran.com, where you can read the surahs, the lines in English with the Arab, and someone is singing the original ancient Arabic verses, which is
Important.
quite an interesting trip. I've only came to like Surah 6 or something. And I cannot judge preemptively because I have not read the entire Quran and Hadith, but I do have to say those first six surahs, which is like half an hour, 40 minutes of content altogether, if you listen to it, is like one big serenade onto, which is tragically even tragic, the woes of the Bani Israel and the Christians. So the children of Israel and the Christians of the time. And you can tell that there is just this certain theological dispute between Muhammad's interpretation of the Abrahamic traditions and what the early Christians and, let's say, first diaspora or local Arabic Jews thought at the time. That's it. And of course, Muhammad is famous for beheading 600 Jews at one time in Medina because they didn't recognize him or ignored some kind of visitation, as well as we can easily guess what happened to all those Jewish tribes and massive Christian colonies and countries in the region that are now no more extant. So it's the interesting thing I thought was, wow, actually the Muslims have an inbred antipathy towards Christians, but even more so towards Jews. And it is because of a 6th century theological dispute that, if we're intellectually honest, no, not even a Muslim scholar, but no one could fully comprehend. No one can wind back time to the 6th century and know what Muhammad was thinking exactly, or what these practices were exactly at that time.
Oh,
sad.
It's sad, but it also goes further. I mean, during periods when the Arab Empire was successful, I think the Abbasids and so on, actually was a very tolerant society.
Mm.
It had scope for that. And then when they became much less successful, became less tolerant.
Right. But can I ask you a question? Do you think, because of course I know these historical highlights, I also know people who are a little bit more cynical about it. But if we take, for example, high-rise medieval Baghdad or Damascus, or if we take Spanish Al-Andalus, which are always exemplars of high levels of support of, for example, mathematicians or philosophers, conserving of the Greeks, conserving of the Aristotle and Plato, but also, even as it is, of course, a dhimmi kind of like texts, kind of slightly humiliated minority, but like quite a harmonious coexistence with the Muslims towards Jews and Christians.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a inherent, fundamental, existential difference between the Islamic texts and their culture and, for example, the Christian texts and their culture, because they've both produced in times very intolerant and rather tolerant circumstances? Or do you think that is coincidence? Because that's where I lean towards, but maybe I'm just biased and wrong. I have the sense that even though Christianity, and if we go far back enough, Judaism itself have had their strongly intolerant streaks, there is something uniquely resistant within Islam towards what we call secular humanist or multi-theological structures. And I'm not sure, maybe I'm just very biased and
look,
in that.
Look, it
What do you
took
think?
Christianity a long time to adapt to diverse societies, to getting along with other people and so on. You had the 7 Years' War, you had all 30 Years' War, terrible situations.
Right.
Catholics and Protestants. And of course, during the Crusades, it was a disaster for Jews.
Yeah.
But one major difference between Islam and Christianity is Christianity is 650 years older.
Right.
And it's had to go through the Enlightenment and all sorts of things and reached a point of accommodation with others. I hope it doesn't take 600 years for this to happen. But I think having the experience of this happening within the Western world, it may be possible to accelerate the adaptation of Islam to a multiverse world with different sects coexisting without the notion that one has to be superior to the other, charge taxes to the other, and so on.
Right.
We'll see. I mean, how this works out, I don't see how you can maintain the supremacist view of Islam in a diverse world. And the question is, how will it be achieved? And I think one sees, I mean, one of the things that is useful is in the Hadiths. There are some that are pro-Semitic, pro-Israel, and pro-Jews, and so on. It's a matter of gaining acceptance to that. I mean, to a certain extent, in all religions, there are good and less good features. And time has generally softened the edges.
Yeah.
It'll do so with Islam. One can hope.
Well, the big tragedy, of course, with the 7th of October was that actually Israel was reaching a far more harmonious coexistence with its neighbors and even peace with
I
some.
mean, this is so silly at present. I mean, Israel is hardly perfect, but you know, its Islamic is Muslim citizens are citizens. You go to the Hebrew University, you go to Tel Aviv University, you know, they're fully represented among the students. You go to an Israeli hospital, the likelihood is your surgeon will be a Muslim.
Right.
You know, in Atlanta, Georgia, the Israeli consul was an Arab.
Wow.
So, you know, it's only, for instance, in the PLO area that they demand there be no Jews. And yet, apartheid is the accusation thrown at Israel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what do we do with these naive millennials? These mostly white American or white European.
Actually, that's not so true. I mean, this is one of the things we'll have to settle out at some point. But at MIT, my impression is most of the students are not going along with this, that the demonstrators, around 50% of them are not even belonging to MIT. And that among the ones that are at MIT, a very large percentage are Muslims from the Middle East. And so to assume these are representative may be a mistake, I think.
Right. And I also have seen footage of things getting heated up quite a bit because there also appear a lot of either students or people attracted to the notion of a good brawl that want to fight these people. So you have like these little university yard brawls springing up in the United States and even also in some parts of the UK or the Netherlands right now. Do you think we have to worry about civil war?
Because as I mentioned, the two are bizarrely related, but what about the farmers in the Netherlands? Have they woken up to how they're being screwed?
Well, there's a very strong, almost international farmers movement growing, of course, in the Netherlands, Germany particularly, even Poland it's starting. And of course, they align with, for example, Canadian farmers, but also Canadian trucker movements.
Sure.
It's a very hot, heated topic. And of course, there are just a lot of them. They have very big tractors, so they're a little hard to control. No, I think it's a fascinating time, also very dangerous. I love my history, so I'm very.
Do you realize that the case against farmers, I mean, asking them to kill their cattle and so on, is, even no matter what you believe about climate, even if you're a catastrophist, the case against the farmers is absolute nonsense. I mean, politicians, I think one problem I see is I realize that most people in politics are completely innumerate and illiterate concerning science. And so they were told that a molecule of methane is more powerful than a molecule of CO2. And cattle burp methane.
Right.
Get rid of them. You do the arithmetic, and the generation of methane is tiny compared to the generation of CO2. So essentially, if you got rid of methane totally, it would hardly make a dent in what CO2 was doing, if you believe CO2 is dangerous.
Well, if you're going to get the farmer subject out of the closet, I'm going to have to put my tinfoil hat on, because that's where I see, where I can have the idea that I can see truly through the malicious intent, or the, even if it's subconscious, why the farmers are being attacked. Because if we take exactly that history of not only the Second World War, but this other gigantic genocidal history that for some reason has not penetrated the Western European mind. But you can ask the Poles or the Czechs or the Romanians, and they will firmly affirm what I'm saying, is they have no knowledge whatsoever about what happened in Russia and Eastern Europe under Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah.
The point with farmers is also within the fascist developments here in the West, like the Nazi developments. What is the thing with farmers? We had in the Second World War in Holland, I'm going to speak from my own Dutch history right now. We had, of course, the big 44 famine. Well, Holland is a country quite rich in food, so we haven't probably had much of a famine since late medieval times. It was the first famine to hit that region in a very long time. We also had the problem with, of course, Jews having to seek refuge or seek hiding. The oppressive tyrants, which were the Germans at the time, had an interest in finding people from the resistance, American or Canadian or British or Polish parachute troopers who landed or who dropped weapons for the Dutch resistance, people of the Dutch resistance. And they also, in a way, of course, as people always, psychopaths in power always do, have a certain interest in impoverishing or making dependent the people, especially if they are a threat to become a threat to rise up to that power. Who were the ones who could hide Jews, hide parachutists, and secure food in the Dutch famine? Farmers.
Same in France.
Same in France. Who were the ones that were first targeted by the insane Bolshevik policies? For example, in Ukraine, killing 6 million people deliberately. The farmers.
Starving them.
The big farmers, the kulaks, the bigger peasants, even those who had 2 cows instead of 1, they all went to that, let's say, red Holocaust, that meat grinder. So it's always the farmers. And I think it has something to do with people being connected to the earth, people being self-reliant, self-supplying, people having land and nature around them, people being able to produce things, people being able to hide things, and people having a felt sense of sovereignty. And very banally, people owning their land. I think in the Netherlands, because of course land is relatively scarce here, we are a country like 80% the size of the state of Maine, but we have almost 20 million inhabitants and over 40 cities with more than 100,000 inhabitants proper. So we're quite a densely populated little post stamp, and as well one of the most wet, fertile deltas in the world. together with Cairo or Bangladesh. So land is a thing here. It's worth a lot of money. And I think there's something very banal about that. I think they just want to take away that sovereignty from that particular class of people so they can force any energy policy, any food distribution policy onto the people who are then completely dependent of their African beef and their lettuce from Jamaica, as a matter of speech. And at the same time, they just want the land to build houses on, to own, so that you don't own it and they can make money off of it, and not you, you little peasant. You know, that's I think that's that banal as well. What are your thoughts? Taking my tinfoil hat off again.
No, again, it it's true that farmers, in a sense, represent an independent entity, and any totalitarian movement is going to be upset by that. I mean, you wanted to replace the kulaks by cooperatives,
Right.
which were under your thumb. Yeah, I mean, it was one of the cruelest incidents in modern history, the starvation of farmers, especially in the Ukraine. It's amazing to what extent people actually forget about it. But there has to be a folk memory of that, I suspect.
Well, I do think in these countries people know all too well. I think, of course, it's a different. If you go to Poland, for example, my girlfriend has had a Polish grandparent, so she has a tad bit of Polish heritage. But I've spoken to people in my many odd jobs as a failed to debut writer. I've had some odd jobs, and of course, there's a lot of Polish work migrants here, and
Sure.
some of them just people looking for blue collar jobs, but also like stranded intellectuals, because of course Poland has its challenges economically. So I've spoken to a lot of people who are from Poland, and if you ask them the question, who would you prefer, Hitler or Stalin? They all immediately say Stalin. Of course, they are not Polish Jews who would probably
Yeah.
answer that question otherwise, and no longer exist. But that's a telling thing, I think, and I think it's a. I have this. Putting my tinfoil hat on again. I wonder how it could be that even through the Cold War, where we in the United States, Canada, and the Commonwealth countries and Western and Southern Europe were so afraid of communism, but especially, of course, the nuclear threat and the totalitarian threat and the expansionist threat of the USSR. How after the collapse of the Soviet Union and throughout the entire Cold War, generations could arise who know absolutely zilch about how much communism or Marxism is on par with Nazism and fascism and its ugliness and genocidal nature, even more so, 6 times more deadly than all the fascist experiments combined.
Well,
Can they
I
not
mean,
know that? Isn't there an agenda to not knowing that?
yeah, I mean, one of Stalin's great triumphs was to label National Socialism as the right.
Right.
It's a major difference between the States and Europe. The right in the States is primarily defined by economics, free enterprise, this sort of thing. In Europe, the right is defined by nationalism.
Mm. I'm not sure if I fully agree with you in that, in the sense that I
But
think
if you look at Le Pen, National Front here in France,
you have these nationalist, populist, what Hitler would have called the Völkisch kind of like aspect of like wearing the silly little hat and being nationalist. Of course, after decades of woke insanity, they've rattled that actually asleep monster in the cage, and now you see a little bit of that resurgence, but like the pussy nose colonial rind of it. No, I think the problem with the United States actually is, that's my conviction. I think the one good thing that came of these world wars was that Europe, in particular, was taught don't do this. Like true nationalism and mobilization and this love, this philanthropy of war has had its cruel lesson. whereas the United States, being a major world force that has some quite bloody civil wars, but never had their entire country occupied or leveled, carpet bombed to the Stone Age. It didn't. I think nationalism, in a sense, survived more in the United States. Not the particular Volkish variety, because over here, peoples have been continually living here in culture for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. So there's this blood and soil kind of, or this very ingrained regional, not even national, even regional fanaticism among peoples. You can tell by soccer matches, the old rivalries, medieval warfare between castles is being battered out by the fist between Utrecht and Amsterdam, or Paris and London, or whatever, or even West Ham in London and East End of London. They like to go and meet with the fist. But in America, there's this America, America, America. Every movie has American sniper, American hero, American this, flag, flag, flag. That's something that didn't survive here because of the wars. Like, you don't see Prussian flags or the Lille de France lily everywhere, and like I think the World Wars and even the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean Wars have had their effects here.
I think they're different, though, as you say. The American version never had a folkish quality.
Yes.
Built into it was the notion of unity of difference. And I think that's been healthier.
Yes.
I don't find, how shall I put it, in voting for someone, I actually make it a minimum requirement that the candidate love the United States.
Right.
I think there is a difference between love of country and racial nationalism.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the interesting thing about the United States, of course, is historically that it has been a migration experiment where initially, of course, later there have been a lot of course, forced immigration from Africa, but also the Western states that were originally, of course, Mexican, and of course a lot of Asian migrants in the last half of a century. But originally, of course, it was a European migratory project, which soon implemented slavery from Africa and the Indies and other influxes.
well, slavery, I mean,
Yeah,
importing it is not fair in the sense slavery until the middle of the 18th century was ubiquitous. I don't think people normally even questioned it.
yeah,
It's a little bit like the biblical description. This was one of the segments of society.
yeah,
Or when the Romans conquered something, of course, they took them and enslaved them.
yeah.
In the case of the Ottoman Empire, slaves were actually a somewhat privileged class. They were the janissaries. They ran the place.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They were the
I
slave
mean,
police. The slave police.
yeah, I mean, so it was only with the Enlightenment that one decided this was incompatible with an enlightened world. And that it took another 80 years for half the US to be broken of that. It doesn't surprise me too much. I mean, the history of slavery in the US is not without interest. I mean, it probably would have fallen apart almost at independence until the Industrial Revolution in England, which then developed this extreme need for cotton. And so that was easy to do with slaves. And the South had the proper area for that, for rice and cotton and so on. That America fought a civil war, people argue it wasn't really about slavery. It was.
Yeah,
And
mostly.
500,000 men died fighting that war. It
Yeah,
was the bloodiest war America has ever fought. And, you know, it didn't progress smoothly. It's now forgotten, but I mean, the Democratic Party endorsed segregation.
Yeah.
And it took another 100 years, basically, to end that. It's ironic that you had all these things which I would say constituted progress, and now suddenly you have a movement in America to begin splitting blacks and whites.
Yes, it's just as people shouting for Hamas in exactly the neighborhoods in Amsterdam that only 80 years ago were violently rid of their Jews. It's just such a
You have the crazy
psychosis for it.
or gays for Hamas. I mean, it's just insane.
Do you agree with me with the notion? Because I think America is such an interesting project because it is I would say America actually is initially Europe, the remix. If we take like the word remix, it's like British and Dutch, and then Germans, Italians, Irish people, Lithuanian, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian Jewish people, Russian Jewish people, Africans, Native Americans, blah, in the big old
By the
melding.
way, one of the most successful groups in America are Nigerians.
Wow.
Their income is well above average.
What do you think it is?
It's, how should I put it? If you don't start out thinking that you should be oppressed, you're not oppressed.
Right.
I mean, it's never been color per se. One of the most successful groups in America are Indians,
Right.
East Indians.
Yeah.
And, they can be blacker than the blacks, but that isn't the issue.
No. Do you think America as a country is more race obsessed per se than, for example, Europe and France? Because you have experience, of course, from both the French and American perspective. I have the personal, not to say that one, let's call them continents, so the US or Europe, not that one is more or less racist, but I mean like race obsessed. Every time I read something on Wikipedia about some town in America, you have this demographic that says so many black, white, Hispanic, Indian, Pacific. The rhetoric on American news is very much white, black, Caucasian, etc. I have this sense that the thinking in terms of ethnicity or race is far more common or far more common practice, and almost an obsession in the United States as compared to Europe. Whereas Europe might well be as much or even more or less racist, whatever.
I think one thing you should keep in mind, and I think I'm right on this, that particular emphasis on race has actually increased greatly in recent years.
Yeah.
There are reasons for it. For instance, when I was a student, I think African Americans were only about 2-3% of the students at Harvard, if that much. But they were fully integrated. You didn't think about them particularly differently from anyone else. As the universities made special efforts to recruit Black students, that changed dramatically. So when I started teaching there, when you're teaching, Harvard has this house system like colleges at the English universities. So you get invited to have dinner at one of the houses. Big difference from when I was a student. When I was a student, eating at a table and there were blacks and whites and so on, and no big deal. When I returned, all the blacks were segregated. self-segregated. That's the important point. And why? Because everyone knew they were chosen especially because of their race, and it led to a very uncomfortable situation.
That does resonate with me. I believe I will send you afterwards the link. This African American guy who's making documentaries right now, and he made this beautiful documentary in which he stated somewhat a similar acclaim, namely that I'm getting a little chaotic. A number of episodes of my podcast ago, I had two scientists on from the University of Amsterdam and the University of Utrecht, the city where I'm from, and we discussed the woke phenomenon. And one of them, Steyer, he's called, he mentioned, because he is a social scientist and also a historian, that if you measure the degree of performative function of African Americans by whatever metrics, you see this very optimistic trend from the early 20th century until, let's say, the 80s.
Yep.
And which is exactly the point where two things were rolled out: affirmative action and support for single mothers in terms of welfare.
Precisely. The destruction of the family.
The nuclear unit.
Yep.
And positive discrimination.
Yeah.
And they broke a very hopeful, if I have to believe him, as well as the documentaries of the African American guy, they were well on their way of being just normalized in performative standards.
Yeah. That was certainly my impression. And by every metric, things were getting better and better. There was even a crazy metric which nobody understood, of IQ increasing. Which, and all these things got broken by the so-called Great Society. It's very strange. I mean, ghettoization was always occurring, but it was breaking up. I remember I was teaching a course in differential equations at Harvard, and there were 3 Black students in the class who had gone to the same high school I had gone to, which was Bronx Science. So I invited them to lunch as fellow graduates of the same high school. And I inadvertently asked what was probably an ill-advised question. I asked them, were people proud of them going to Harvard and studying computer science, whatever they were studying? And they laughed at me. They said, "Are you kidding? The heroes in our neighborhood are the pimps and the numbers runners.
Right.
We're considered sellouts."
Too white.
Yeah, whiteness.
That's sad.
Yeah, I mean, there was an encouragement of a certain culture, which, you can see it when I return to the Bronx occasionally. The neighborhood I grew up in is now largely Hispanic.
Right.
Now, visually, it has made almost no difference to the neighborhood. Where it's a difference is the stores and so on are owned by Hispanics. You still have St. Nicholas of Tolentine, the local church, and so on. If you go to part of the Bronx that was Black, very different visually. It looks like Dresden after the war.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember those footage from the 80s, like.
Yeah, just destroyed. And part of the reason, and again, I don't know what the dynamic of this is, But if you are in Harlem,
Mm.
the Black area, and you make it, so to speak, you are going to college, you're doing this and that, you get out of there.
Right.
And so if you have commerce, a grocery store in the ghetto, it once was Jewish, it then became others, it became Korean, it became this, it became that, but wasn't so much Black. And so people, when there was a riot, they would destroy their grocery store because it wasn't them. Whereas if you went to the Hispanic neighborhood, the commerce was Hispanic. There was nothing, you didn't destroy it. If somebody made it in the neighborhood, they stayed in the neighborhood and became prominent citizens of that neighborhood.
Right.
I don't know how you deal with these things.
But hasn't that changed, for example, when recently with those BLM riots, it very often were Black homeowners, not only homeowners, business owners who got attacked by these mobs?
Oh, yeah.
When infrastructure was actually attacked.
Yeah, I mean, the cohesion is wrong. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but the, even hip hop and so on, it's glorifying what most people would regard as negatives.
Right.
Well, like with all these things, I mean, I think Niels Bohr said it best, prediction is difficult, especially when it deals with the future.
Yeah. Wow, that's a nice one. Yeah. You got it served right back at you, sir.
It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. You hope it corrects itself. But yeah, your description of things looking as though they were progressing nicely, and then when it became a massive effort to, quote, accelerate it, the things done actually made things worse.
Yeah.
Um, there's a kind of economic aspect to that too. I think one of the things that people on the right, increasing in the American sense, the economic sense, realizing is Adam Smith was probably right that we don't know how to engineer things, but if you leave freedom for things to evolve, people will automatically, in their own self-interest, more likely do the right thing than
Right.
if you have somebody at the top saying, I know how to do it, and 9 times out of 10 is wrong.
Well, let me give you a very comical parable. I personally think neither full-fledged libertarian capitalism nor any degree of socialism above democratic socialism on a capitalist blueprint ends up very easily in a situation that is not really beneficial or functional. And in the United States of America, because you have this very clear 4-year term, as do we, but you do not have a multi-party coalition style government. You have like a bipartisan system. You always see this left-wing president making everything left again, then right-wing president returning the old opus mondandi to the right, left, right, ping-ponging back and forth. In Holland, for example, not even Europe, but specifically Holland, which is one of the most capitalist and socialist countries in the world at the same time, and therefore representative of most of the Scandinavian countries, and to a lesser extent, Belgium, France, and Germany. Every little thing until this cup or this pen is split in the middle, being at the same time very capitalist sponsored and at the same time socialist, which is, I would say, even a more ground hell than the United States system, where it just pendulums back and forth. it's personally, if you ask me, I think there are some domains in life which are best addressed in a libertarian or free market way, and there are a few domains in life, perhaps healthcare, perhaps some small functions that belong to collective or government
Actually,
entities
the most
that should be dealt
obvious
with.
one is war.
War.
I mean, military has always been assumed to be a property of the state.
Yes. But if we try to imagine it not to be, it's also quite scary. If it's like one big, what's called Wagner Institute.
No, no, no. I mean, no, it certainly,
Okay, we shoot it.
yeah, the foundation of America
Yeah,
assigned certain things to the central government, but actually most things were assigned to the states or to the individuals.
right.
And the dispersal of power and responsibility, I think, was important. I mean, America, I feel, was very lucky in its foundation. By and large, it was not founded by politicians.
Right.
I mean, Washington just dreamt about returning to his farm.
Yeah,
Adams, even in the days of the horse and buggy, would try to return to Boston on weekends.
right.
No, I mean, that was very lucky. They tried initially to avoid partisanship, period. And that failed pretty quickly by Jefferson's time.
I think when I was younger and also something resembling a communist mindset or a woke mindset, I would argue like, oh, America with its imperialism and Vietnam and such a. Whereas nowadays, I'm quite happy that there is one little place, not even within the world, but one place within the West that has clung to its truly, let's say, libertarian outlook, because of course the United States is far more, let's say, liberal in the literal anti-governmental sense, but also a liberal in legal and libertarian cultural sense than, for example, most European countries. Because of course it was founded by people fleeing Europe to be more free, like the people who are tired
Well,
of overpopulated bureaucratic nonsense.
that could be exaggerated. I mean, you mentioned Protestantism. The state of Maryland was created for Catholics.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Maria Land.
but essentially, the English were taking the various sectarian groups and letting them emigrate to the U.S. and forming their own states. So Pennsylvania was Quaker and
Right.
Maryland was Catholic.
They exported. They were like penal colonies in Australia, but then like, please go ahead, move. We do not.
Georgia was a penal colony.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it had essentially this is a punishment you could accept, and it was a certain period.
Yeah. But I do think there is something sound in America's antipathy towards communism. And I think, I don't know why, as I mentioned before, Europe, even though half of Europe was under communism, how Western Europe could fail to see that notion of danger and of even I would argue worse totalitarianism, not per se for Jewish people as an exemption, but like in generic terms, as a totalitarian structure, even perhaps more frightening than the other totalitarian structures and more lethal in most of the world. How
Well,
could they miss?
totalitarian structures are fundamentally accepting the notion that there are people who know better.
Mm,
And that's usually turned out to be a mistake. I mean, from a certain perspective, we know that for any given question, there are an infinitude of wrong answers and very few right answers.
and even the right answers are iffy.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, in mathematics, it's clean. There's one correct answer and infinite wrong answers.
Right. Yeah, it sure is a. I think it's all as you noticed, and I'm surprised so many people fail to see that. Of course, National Socialism is just National Socialism, where where communism is international socialism,
Exactly.
and even fascism is a brand of socialism in a sense because it's also heavily
Yes,
statist and
statist.
Marx influenced. Just
Absolutely.
even
No, I
Goebbels loved Marx, and as much as Nietzsche, also Marx was heavily admired, even among many Nazis. So it's a very it's
mean,
like
you know,
Wahhabism and Salafism, like it's the narcissism of little differences.
with the royal family in England before the war, when Edward VIII, having married a divorcee, had to abdicate. That's what he's remembered for. But he was a strong fan of Hitler.
Yes, as was one of our royal princes, Prince Klaus, who they recently found his Nazi membership card after a lifelong denial.
I mean, no, it was, quote, a respectable position.
Yeah.
In the Harvard University chapel, uh, there is actually a list of all the Harvard men who served in the war. One of them was a German serving in the Nazi army
Wow.
as a chaplain.
The guy praying over dying, wounded soldiers.
Yeah. It's
But how come? Because I've recently started reading Solzhenitsyn's famous work, The Gulag Archipelago. And he has this beautiful bit about when he compares his native Russia to Germany post-war. And he makes this beautiful essayistic, it's almost a prayer in its syntax. He describes how even though it of course can never rhyme the horrors of the war and of the bombings and of the concentration camps and of all the misery of the war itself on whatever side, whether American or German or Jewish or Soviet. But he says there is a certain cleansing when you have these Nuremberg trials and when you keep implementing this kind of notion of law and of responsibility and of response, and whereas he himself visited some of these or saw live recordings of of some of these Nuremberg trials, and he says that the fact that there are some of these Nazi high officials who have, after having being witness to their own and other cases for years and many sit downs on end, get repulsed by what they have themselves have done and forego their defense and say, no, I agree. I have done exactly these things. And now after reaching introspection, I'm shocked and revolted by having to acknowledge this, that there is a certain spiritual or cultural cleansing that happened. And and then compares it to Russia, where it's, oh, that's the past. We shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah, no, the airbrushing, but that comes up today. One of the things about the Holocaust was that the Nazis went to some degree to try and hide it. There was an implicit understanding, often it was explicitly expressed to them, that we should hide it because people won't understand.
Right.
October 7th struck me. I mean, they were videoing the whole thing. They were proud of it.
Right.
It's not a subtle difference. And it hardly excuses the Nazis that they realized there was something to be ashamed of.
Right.
I really wonder if there weren't something to be ashamed of.
It's a very interesting point. Do you think the Nazis were ashamed towards the non-Nazi world as they envisioned it to be judgmental? Or do you think there was this sense of self that they were being a little naughty?
It's a hard thing to judge. I mean, on the one hand, you would have pictures of the people operating the death camps celebrating a holiday, and they looked like normal people and having a good time and so on.
Right.
On the other hand, they did go to great extremes to keep it a secret in some sense. So there was at least an implicit notion of shame.
Yes.
I mean, you know, it's long been pointed out that the people running the camps were not devils. They were pretty normal people. And we still haven't come to grips with how is it that normal people can behave this way? But there's something radically different with groups like Hamas, where there is pride in what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the 6th century, I would say.
Right. I mean, there's a bit of that.
And if we compare to the Nazi shame concerning this execution of late-stage Holocaust, when you read Solzhenitsyn's work, there's also, of course, he is inside a concentration camp system, which is unlike the Holocaust system in that it's not an extermination system. Even though you could argue there are sadistic elements into
Oh, yes.
releasing prisoners 1 month before they would die of a certain disease caught by being exhausted, is also very sadistic and mind-boggling in another sense. But of course, they were not gas chambers or not extermination camps. But there is this other insanity that struck me. Of course, the insanity of the Nazis was this cold, autistic, Germanic execution of something of like a racial hygiene thing, and almost, yeah, in the sense celebrating Christmas with your little German family on top of a death camp, and almost failing to see the dissonance going on there, which is of course Germanic and autistic. But within the Soviet experiment, there was this other extremity that struck me time and time again, where they would torture people in very extreme ways, almost not unlike Auschwitz. But they knew they were extracting a false concession on the basis of fictitious stories. So perhaps if we take a Nazi or we take a Hamas fighter, the Nazi probably religiously believes there is racial difference and racial purity. Jews are bad, and Bolshevism is the great fear, for example. If we take a Hamas fighter, he will think Israel is the abomination on earth. Jews are also bad inherently because Muhammad said so. And we should strive for a Islamic caliphate in line with the early descendants of Muhammad or Saladin or something like that. If we take the communists, they probably also do religiously believe that we should permanently strive for the permanent revolution and kill as many people as we need or change as many things as we need to develop this hierarchy-free new Soviet Übermensch idea. But they knew, even if that was their religion, similar to the Salafist or the Nazis, they of course have their own ideological infection, which is probably on par. But they knew, look, Goebbels knew that he was lying and exaggerating in its propaganda. He admitted that in several occasions. Leon Trotsky or Lenin probably knew that they were lying about things as well. But the guy who tortured these gulag or prisoners in the prison system, they knew full well that they beat some guy up or held him up in an unnatural position for 4 days and starving them and battering them with sleeplessness and pulling out their nails and whatever. They knew that they were doing that to his wife, to make his wife confess something about him. That wasn't true. They only cared about the signature. That is a range of psychosis.
I mean,
just to get the numbers, or to get this glee of, okay, now you have admitted to being an enemy of the Soviet project. And they knew that they were extracting a lie, but still they believed there was a benevolence in some order or what to having this guy deported and his girlfriend betray him as well.
Yeah, look,
Human beings are terrifying, Dick.
I put it, I mean, people can behave in a variety of ways. The one I always found interesting was Molotov's wife.
Mm.
I mean, Molotov, while serving, his wife was in the Gulag. And when she was finally released, she still expressed the greatest admiration for Stalin. I mean, the capacity of people to be incoherent, I think, is impressive.
I recently, yesterday or the day before, I saw live footage of the military parade in Moscow.
Yeah.
And they were, of course, as they have done for 200 years now, parading their tanks and their nukes and all that stupid boo-bah-ha. But they're just happily flaunting Stalinist or Soviet flags besides the current Russian flag. And I think that's so in line with what Solzhenitsyn wrote, but also so crazy that Putin, who obviously has inherited this kind of intergenerational traumatic image of the threat of Nazism, so much so that he can confuse a few Nazi Ukrainian battalions with a pro-European Jewish president, and has this of course, a mingled propagandistic lie. But I also do think within him there is this genuine insanity stemming from this Leningrad siege trauma of his parents. Whereas at the same time, he can flaunt these Stalinist flags and not see the irony of the one thing that killed more Russians than ever did and ever will. It's so bizarre to me.
Yeah,
And
well,
Russians, they're like, oh, Stalin, great guy, should have killed more people, even though their grandparents.
Putin has gone through several stages.
Yeah.
I mean, he began with economic liberalization and so on and so forth. Power does have a corrupting influence on people. And, I think we're watching that with him. Russia has made some very peculiar decisions since the end of communism. I remember, I mean, when essentially the Soviet Union collapsed and when the communist bloc collapsed, there are a lot of lectures in Cambridge on how do you reconstitute a private economy.
Mm.
It was, generally analogized to unscrambling an egg.
Right.
And, I don't think people knew how to do it. So you ended up in the Soviet Union with the oligarchs.
Right.
Because, you said, let's be fair, let's give every worker a share in the industry. Most people, the share wasn't worth much, so they sold it. And all of a sudden, some people were collecting them and
Right.
became billionaires. There was no follow-up. There was no clear-cut understanding. How the heck do you resume a normal economy? The upshot, I think, I may be mistaken, is that the former Soviet Union today is an economy based on raw materials.
Right.
Rather than manufacturing. And it reminds me of a study done in Japan on what would have been the impact on the Japanese economy had Japan had raw materials, which it hardly does. And the answer was it would have a slightly lower GDP. because raw materials went down in price, whereas manufactured went up.
Right. And also because, of course, it incentivizes a nation to compensate for.
Yeah, I mean, all sorts of things happened.
Yeah.
Uh, the Soviet Union ignored that entirely when it broke up. And you know, I don't understand it any more than I understand Western Europe and the US deindustrializing.
Right now.
Yeah, it sounds crazy to me.
And dangerous, of course, if you don't want to become a colony of China or some other
In
party.
China, anyway. I mean, the thing that we see, and I don't know if you see it in Europe, it's not obvious to me, but in the US, if you go to Western Massachusetts, which used to be heavily into manufacturing,
Right.
things like electric motors and so on, leather goods, the towns are devastated. You have drug problems, you have everything. It's just sad. And you realize in any good society, by definition, I mean, whatever you feel about IQ, the definition is 0 represents 100. An IQ of 100, half are below, half are above.
Right.
The ones below are not likely to go for higher education, but we have a democracy.
Right.
And within a democracy, everyone votes, and you want everyone to have a sense of dignity.
Right.
For people who are not intellectually oriented, dignity came from earning a living, doing positive work,
Right.
being proud of what they were doing. When you throw that away, half the population is losing their dignity. Welfare can't compensate for that.
Well, I think the ressentiment of the Rustbelt class is a real
Yeah.
thing. I do think America has a very different political and economical makeup. So, for example, in America, it's far easier to fire someone or to bankrupt a business than it is here. It's very hard to fire people here. And the difference in culture is, I'll give you an example. It's a great example. I love it. It's really fun. I was born originally in a neighborhood of a city called Utrecht, which is a city in the central Netherlands. And all Dutch cities, and for that matter, all English or Belgian or whatever cities, they always have this. We talked about the Völkish aspect. There's always this urban white trash OG neighborhood, so to speak. In the movie that you didn't watch, the Google Hunting, it's South Boston, Southie, right? The white working class or the white poor neighborhood. Well, in Europe you have that as well, and they in the half century after the Second World War they used to be hooligan neighborhoods. For example, you see them in those hooligan movies, right? And I was born in the what used to be the Utrecht hooligan neighborhood, which are super lowly educated people living in social housing in a neighborhood that used to be quite poor and especially quite high in crime, and also very geared towards itself. So very isolated, very much like a cultural island, like a clan, very clan-like. And I would say that the average IQ isn't that high there, to put it mildly. I love them. I think they're very funny. They're also very racist, but there's a lot of things to be said about them. But I think they're hilarious, those people. I can speak their accent or imitate their dialect very well. Um, Later on in my life, I started to study playwriting and later screenwriting. So I got involved with the art scene of my city or the urban Western Netherlands, including Amsterdam. And there is this very pervasive idea, because of course it's a very left-wing kind of substratum of society. These cities in general are super left-wing, Amsterdam, Utrecht, Rotterdam, but Amsterdam and Utrecht especially. And what I always found dazzling is this notion of educating the people. And Holland in particular has had this very long tradition of, let's say, social engineering experiments. You could even argue that when the French occupied the Netherlands in the late 18th or century, throughout the early 19th century, under Ludwig Napoleon, which was the younger brother of the Napoleon, and he actually had a quite benevolent effect as a ruler. He was a benevolent colonial ruler, so to speak. And he implemented some of the first socialist, or let's say, social protection legislations. For example, children were not allowed to work anymore at a certain stage. Because you had like factory laboring, and of course children were working in factories, and all these made these precautions. So the Netherlands have had one of the oldest traditions of social experimenting, and one of them was to, for example, prevent ghettoization through mixing peoples, which started in the 1930s and is still being done today. For example, Utrecht City, where I'm from, has the largest Moroccan subpopulation of the Netherlands, and the Moroccans are the largest Islamic immigration group among non-Dutch immigration descendants, followed by the Turks, and the largest concentration of them is in my city of Utrecht. So you have these pronounced high-rise social high-rise social housing ghettos in the peripheries of the city, which were quite intense in their concentration of both demographics, 90% Moroccan neighborhoods, for example, with very high crime. And they keep breaking that up. So they tear down some of these flats, leave some of them standing, build different homes, try to mingle the people. So it's another example of this social engineering. But it's very deep inside of the country. And you could also make very laughable parables with more negative manifestations. For example, the Christian missionaries going to the Dutch East Indies or into Africa to educate the natives about God, but also this idea which existed in the Dutch East India colony of like elevating the natives, which has this kind of ooga booga racist undercurrent to it. Oh, these poor Voltairean wildlings, we should educate them and we should bring civilization to these people. Well, I was in this after chat of a very dull, boring play, elitist play, filled with like these rich, what you would call democratic elitists. So like these urban rich people going to the theater to feel cultured and glee. And there was this African theater maker and a lot of diversity, like forced diversity into the discussion panel after the play. And it was all a lot about bringing civilization to the people. And they actually said, like, shouldn't we bring theater to Sterrewijk? And Sterrewijk is that neighborhood I just mentioned, the former hooligan neighborhood. And they asked the audience, like, put your hand up. Who is someone from the neighborhood or knows someone from the neighborhood? What do you think about the notion? I put on my hand as I'm not a real Sterrewijker, not a real person from that neighborhood in the sense that my parents are not that typical Sterrewijk, but I was born there. And it's on why can't we just leave people instead of like liking soccer and us liking theater? And they were like, oh, offended and shocked that I would say such a thing. And I mentioned that, isn't this a bit like bringing civilization to the natives in Indonesia? And they were totally baffled and annoyed, and they grabbed the microphone from my hand and quickly rendezvoused for our next question. Do you see the psychology? Sorry,
Yeah.
it's long rant.
Look, you can find numerous variants. One of the things that always interested me about Germany was the presence of an opera house in every town.
Mm.
And at least pre-war, people I knew from that period just took for granted you went to the opera. When they left Germany, they never went to the opera. There were certain cultural things you were supposed to do. And it sounds as though this is what people were trying to emulate. It doesn't sound to me terrible. It just sounds a little naive.
Right. But isn't that part of, like, if we discuss, for example, these woke millennials that are preaching Hamas or other subjects, we have a very uh, we have a word in Dutch that is very hard to translate into English, and it's a shame English doesn't provide the same type of word, because it's I think the crux of either communist or woke or Nazist or whatever utopian thinking, the naivete about that. In Dutch, it's called maakbaarheid. So it would be something like machbaarheid in German, or like editability, changeability, malleability, something like that. The possibility
Kind of.
of changing a thing or
Yeah.
adapting a thing.
Well, the combination of malleable and adaptable.
Exactly. And the Dutch, I think, are among the world's worst right now, especially these left-wing boomer Democrat elitists, but the culture in general, for that matter, because in the Netherlands it's completely insane. Every tree is placed in rows, and the country is so cultivated you can barely breathe. So they've made a cultural sport out of it. But in the mindset, there's this aspect that they genuinely believe this kind of like socialist tabula rasa idea. For example, my aunt, my favorite aunt, got really offended when I said that IQ is something that we, of course, mostly inherit. That there is the existence of IQ difference shocked
Yeah.
and offended my aunt to a great extent. And
Oh,
would
yeah. No, I've run into this, that people who believe that IQ is something socially determined,
right.
that you can.
Which, of course, any sane person would agree to an extent it is. You can have people with a variation characteristics, but any baby monkey you will not give love or food will die, whether it's a smart or a dumb monkey. So
No,
it's always, of course, this element of whether or not this potential is fully nurtured or not compared to, but the existence of IQ difference per se.
how shall I put it? Nobody argues with difference in athletic ability.
Don't they? With all these trans athletes running rampant,
No,
right?
no, 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 no. That's a different issue. But I mean, you realize that there's nothing racist about basketball teams being largely black.
And tall.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
going together.
yeah, exactly.
Um, it's, nobody argues that there's anything wrong with the fact that in the Boston Marathon, it's always someone from East Africa who wins.
Yeah, exactly.
So we acknowledge there are differences. It's interesting. I mean, we've both encountered people who take offense at the notion that intelligence is a similar matter of heredity and so on. They want it to be malleable.
And do you think that is more likely born out of this well-intentioned infantile naivete, that they see hope for all the people and that is just due to unequal opportunity? Or is there more of do you think, what Nietzsche would call a ressentiment kind of backing, that there has to be oppression and inequality, therefore I am, therefore my life or my potency, which I would not psychologically dare to address, so I externalize it onto all the
Who
women, black or Jewish people in the world, or African or third world people in the
knows?
world?
I mean, for instance, we're talking about people who are not interested in intellectual pursuits still deserve dignity.
Right, yes.
Um, and when you are deindustrializing, maybe you would prefer not to believe that. That, okay, and you see this in America. I mean, okay, we're going to get rid of all these coal miners. They'll have to learn to be programmers. Well, maybe they just are more suited to be coal miners.
That's a great point, Dick. I never linked those two. But of course, the deindustrialization, and then what do we do with these people? Oh, of course, they're malleable little superhumans, each and every one.
Yeah.
Don't you feel guilty, Dick, about your achievements as a genius scientist being so much due to just nurture privilege? Don't you think you should give away a little bit of your knowledge to this poor kid in Africa?
I mean,
Aren't you ashamed, Dick?
not
Take,
particularly,
taking up all this nurture from someone else.
but how shall I put it? I didn't feel that way. And, one of the differences I had was I was not ambitious. My family had nothing, never owned a car, never owned a home. And that was fine. And my father barely spoke English. My mother's was fairly good. The system when I went to school was one which benefited me. If you did well, they pushed you on. I remember when I finished high school, I needed work to earn some money to go to college. And my parents were not in a position to do so. And I told them, look, I got a job with Radio Corporation of America, and I was earning, I think, $60 a week. I said, I can help out. I don't have to go to college. And it didn't seem to me that was going to be a terrible sacrifice. Among other things, and one of the strange things at that time, this was in the 50s, half the engineers at RCA, Radio Corporation of America, were promoted from technician, not from university graduates.
Right.
And so there are plenty of opportunities, and you could function and contribute and so on. And it was very different from families that were pushing their kids. But it was possible then. And I think it may be less possible today. I'm not sure.
Because of this,
But
because of a certain inflation?
I don't know. Well, part of it is, for instance, with Asians, actually with Koreans mostly, the families are very, very intense on the kids producing. I was, going to school at a time when, quote, progressive views of education were prominent. I couldn't read until grade 3. And no teacher bothered me about it. You're having trouble reading, paint, do something else.
Right.
It worked with me. It may not have worked with others. But I grew up, at least at that stage, in a very tolerant environment. One of the things I had that kids today don't have, I had very bright teachers. And my wife doesn't like my saying this, but I blame it on the women's movement. When I went to school, women had very few choices. They could be a teacher, a nurse, a secretary, or a housewife.
Right.
And among these things, being a teacher was the elite. So I benefited from that. Today, a woman can be anything. So being a teacher is near the bottom of the list.
All right. So you mean that in the former situation, so the last stage before true feminist, let's say, homogeneity within society, all the smart women were forced into that profession.
Right.
Now they get stolen for all these either other jobs or even bullshit jobs, and their intellect goes to waste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when you're talking about education declining, that's part of the reason.
Right. And of course, many other factors, as in that they keep lowering standards
Well, they have to.
that to adapt to the dumbing down of society.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not a matter of how shall I put it, intent. It just followed from progress.
Yeah. So could we conclude then, Dick?
Yeah, I think we better.
Yeah, yeah. After this beautiful tangent that we've been following, that the key ingredient to some mode of restoration from this queers for Palestine and bad education and
Climate alarm.
yeah, rising of both communist wokism and Völkish reactionaryism, that perhaps just meritocracy is the answer, the return of meritocracy.
Um, I would say that that's part of it,
Mm.
but I think an equal part of it is preserving the wherewithal for everyone in the society to feel that they're valued.
Mm.
And it isn't, is it better for a person to be valued for what they are, or to have a selective system that only values certain people? If you have a meritocracy without other opportunities, I think you have a problem. If you don't have the other opportunities and you get rid of meritocracy, you're putting people in the wrong place. Um, Part of it gets back to the notion, is it better to open up opportunities at every level, or to make believe you can mold people into something?
Mm.
No, I think, for universities, or for certain, let's say you have an opening for a theoretical physicist. Obviously, you want meritocracy for that, but you don't want that to be the only opening in society.
Right. So actually, what you want to strive for is an excess of opportunity per se, not the attempt to engineer people towards the
I mean,
opportunity.
how shall I put it?
Yeah.
There's a meaning to being a very skilled baker, a very skilled steel worker, a very skilled. There are rooms for merit in everything.
Right.
And allowing that to function throughout the society, you'll have a happier society, I think.
I think that's a very true thing. Well spoken, Dick. I think if I try to make some kind of a conclusive maxim out of it, it should not be a sole meritocracy. There should be a plethora of meritocracies.
Exactly. There should be, opportunities to be the best in your area.
Exactly. To be a dignified steel worker or a dignified meteorologist.
Yeah. Or,
Equally.
look, Western Massachusetts had a lot of small machine shops.
Mm.
These people were very proud of their work. The work is gone.
How to kill the human soul.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, Dick, I think we
Look,
have a beautiful discussion. I love chatting with you. Thanks for being so cordial and open with me. Yeah, I hope you greatly enjoy your stay. For my information, your wife still lives in Paris in part, or are just visiting?
well, no, what we did, I mean, we used to visit frequently when my mother-in-law was alive.
Mm.
And when she died, we had to decide what would be the excuse for visiting France.
Yeah,
And the one advantageous economic move I've ever made, normally I don't, was to look for an apartment in Paris at the bottom of their real estate market. So we have a little apartment. It's in an area, the 11th district. And when we looked for it, my criterion was I wanted a neighborhood that was like the Bronx.
Right. Well,
And we found it. I mean,
bingo. Is it in the north of Paris, like Saint Denis,
it's
or?
the Northeast. It's the 11th district,
Yeah.
the densest population. And it borders, we're right on the border of the 20th. And so it's heavily immigrant, very colorful.
Mm,
And for the most part, people get along.
nice.
So no, we enjoy it. And the fact that it was less expensive than some parts had its own advantage in that it became affordable for people to open decent restaurants that were not too expensive. So
Bingo. Great note to end it on, Dick. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great day and enjoy Paris, and hope to speaking with you in the future.
good luck. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.